At sunrise, the Coliseum was already awake. Its arches caught the first pale strokes of morning, while yesterday's blood clung to the stone like a memory that refused to fade. Beneath the seats, vendors shouted through the chill air, baskets filled with olives and watered wine, preparing for a crowd that hadn't even settled into place. Beyond the iron gates, handlers forced half-starved predators toward the light. Lions with ribs pushing against their skin, elephants stamping in restless fury, panthers dragging their claws across metal bars, sparks snapping in the dimness. From deep within the tunnels came the sharp clang of steel. Not practice swings, not warm-ups, just men testing the blades meant to kill before noon. And over all of it, a low hum grew into a roar as tens of thousands of Romans poured in, hungry for the one thing their empire perfected better than anything else: death dressed as entertainment. The arena was never sport. It was an engine built for cruelty. Emperors flooded the sand to stage naval battles, starved animals to sharpen fear, and forced prisoners to reenact legends that always ended with real bodies cooling on the ground. None of it was accidental. It was policy, stitched deep into the machinery of Rome. Cheering wasn't harmless. It was loyalty, shouted loud enough to echo across centuries. And today, we're walking straight into that shadow. These are the spectacles so brutal, so twisted, they push the Roman appetite beyond its limits. From blood-soaked funeral rites to executions wrapped in theater, we're revealing how an empire forged its glory by turning suffering into applause. Now, take your seat. The gates are beginning to open. The first gladiatorial fight in Rome didn't begin with emperors wrapped in royal purple or fanfare, ringing through the city. It began at a funeral. In 264 BC, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva chose not to honor their father with statues or prayers. They honored him with blood. They armed 3 pairs of slaves and ordered them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market steeped in smoke and the sour scent of dung. It wasn't spectacle, it was obligation, a gift owed to the dead. The custom came from far beyond Rome. In Campania, warriors were slain at graves to quiet restless spirits. Over time, the ritual changed. Random sacrifice became chosen combat. The dead no longer demanded victims, they demanded champions. The Samnites, once Rome's bitter enemies, held these duels with pride, and Roman elites absorbed the practice quickly. Burying a man with treasures meant wealth. Burying him with a blood-drenched spectacle meant power. But funerals were only the beginning. By the 3rd century BC, Rome's leaders realized these fights could do more than honor ancestors. They could strengthen politics. Religious festivals once dedicated to Jupiter now featured gladiators. The Senate called it devotion. The people knew better. It was state-crafted violence, designed to keep Rome unified under fear. Even the armor told stories. Fighters wore symbols of conquered nations. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade, the Gaul with his broad sword. Watching them bleed was watching Rome's victories replayed one slash at a time. Death became propaganda, and as the blood spilled, the venues evolved. Wooden stands gave way to stone amphitheaters, temples dedicated to violence where thousands gathered. The games no longer belonged to grieving families, they belonged to the state. Every drop of blood whispered the same message. Rome controlled men, armies, even death itself. No one then could imagine how far it would go. The roar of the crowd wasn't only for men. It thundered for beasts dragged from the edges of the world. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles from the Nile, even giraffes hauled across burning deserts. They weren't celebrated, they were condemned. Pray for a spectacle Rome called the Damnatio, the hunt. It wasn't survival, it was domination. Proof the empire could capture the wild, starve it, and destroy it in front of 50,000 witnesses. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar set the tone when he paraded a giraffe, the first ever seen in Europe. Rome had no word for it. They called it a camelopard, half camel, half leopard. But its name didn't matter. It was thrown into the arena and torn apart. The message was simple. If Rome could seize the strangest beasts alive, there was nothing it couldn't conquer. When the Coliseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus unleashed a festival soaked in nearly 10,000 animal deaths. Archaeologists later found bones carved with marks of starvation, proof that lions and bears were weakened to guarantee a swift, bloody kill. Even elephants, once instruments of terror on the battlefield, were marched into the arena and slaughtered for cheers. Behind the scenes, the logistics were staggering. Hunters trapping creatures across continents, caravans dragging cages through scorching sand, fleets floating them down the Nile, handlers risking their lives to deliver living trophies to Rome. A panther in the wild was danger enough. Watching one explode from a cage in front of a roaring Coliseum, that was power made visible. Every creature torn apart was another reminder that Rome's reach was limitless. Some emperors made these hunts their personal stage. Commodus, Rome's most flamboyant showman, entered the arena dressed as Hercules. He slaughtered hundreds of animals himself, most of them starved, chained, or crippled to guarantee his victory. He wanted the world to see a god among beasts. What they saw instead was a man desperate for applause. And yet, the people cheered, not out of admiration, out of fear. When an emperor performs, silence becomes dangerous. But beneath the cheers was a quieter tragedy. Writers like Pliny the Elder warned that lions, leopards, even elephants were disappearing from their homelands, hunted to extinction for Rome's entertainment. The Colosseum wasn't just a theater of death. It was a machine reducing the natural world to dust. But Rome didn't care. Extinction was just another cost of empire. When you picture a gladiator, you might imagine two evenly matched warriors locked in noble combat. But Rome rarely offered anything noble. The truth was far darker. Rome engineered imbalance. It designed contests no one could truly survive. Some victims weren't fighters at all. Prisoners, criminals, men dragged from cells and shoved into the arena dressed like clowns, holding wooden swords against trained killers. The crowd roared as the doomed stumbled and died. It was execution disguised as sport. Even the weapons became part of the theater. The retiarius stepped into the light with a fisherman's net and a trident facing the secutor, whose rounded helmet was built to deflect that net. It wasn't just combat, it was suspense, crafted to make 50,000 hearts pause in unison. Would the net ensnare, or would the sword break through? Rome devoured that tension, even when the matches were scripted long before the gates opened. The violence escalated. One fighter thrown against several, entire units clashing like miniature armies, the arena floor turning into a swamp of blood, shattered shields, and mangled limbs. And when the crowd grew numb, Rome pushed further. Female gladiators stepped into the sand in the 1st century AD. Writers mocked them, but the records remain. They fought for real, against beasts, against dwarfs, against each other. Their presence blurred boundaries but sharpened one truth. No one, man or woman, stood outside Rome's appetite for spectacle. Even the helmets were weapons of torment. Some narrowed vision until fighters stumbled half-blind, some muffled sound. Others weighed so much that lifting one's head became a battle of its own. Armor was not always protection. Sometimes it was punishment. And then came the propaganda plays. Gladiators forced to dress as barbarians, reenacting Rome's victories with a foregone ending. Their death wasn't a result. It was a reminder. Rome always won. Every mismatch, every absurd pairing, every gender-bending stunt was designed to shock, to control, to keep crowds begging for more. The Colosseum refused repetition. Violence had to evolve. Cruelty had to innovate. By midday, when the fights had drenched the sand and the audience began to fidget, the arena shifted shape, combat stepped aside, theater walked in, and death stood center stage. Romans called it Damnatio ad Bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It wasn't a sentence. It was a script the victims couldn't rewrite. Criminals, deserting soldiers, rebels, prisoners of war. They all became unwilling actors in a story that always ended the same way, torn apart. Punishment matched crime. Thieves ripped apart by wolves, arsonists burned alive, traitors thrown to lions. Each scene was a twisted morality play, performed in blood. The scale was unimaginable. During Trajan's celebration after his Dacian victory, thousands of captives were slaughtered across 103 relentless days. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Each death placed carefully, each horror timed for maximum suspense. Animals became the co-stars of the nightmare. Lions starved until madness, bears chained in pits goaded into sudden fury. Leopards released in eruptions of pure violence. The crowd never knew. Would it be quick or slow? A clean kill? Or a torment that crawled across the sand? Sometimes, the violence wore the mask of legend. Prisoners forced to act out myths. Orpheus torn apart by beasts. Prometheus chained while vultures circled overhead. These weren't stories anymore. They were executions dressed in the skins of heroes. Death in Rome wasn't enough. It had to perform. The cruelty spread far beyond the jaws of animals. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East, was staged inside the arena itself. Men and women nailed to wooden beams while vendors sold wine and children played nearby. Fire added its own spectacle. Victims wrapped in pitch-soaked tunics were set ablaze, living torches twisting and screaming as the smoke spiraled upward. Tertullian wrote of them, "Living torches." It was no metaphor. It was the truth. These weren't punishments. They were messages carved into human beings. Defy Rome, and you would die slowly, publicly, with an audience of thousands. Some Romans recoiled. Seneca warned that watching these spectacles hardened the soul, draining empathy from the heart. But his voice drowned beneath the cheers of a crowd addicted to cruelty. Rome's imagination didn't stop at sand and steel. Sometimes the city demanded oceans. Mock naval battles, Naumachiae, were spectacles on a scale that bordered on madness. Julius Caesar built a massive basin near the Tiber and filled it with the water in real ships. Thousands of captives were forced aboard, not as actors, but as men sentenced to die. Rival fleets clashed under the roar of a Roman crowd. Arrows whistled, catapults thundered, wood splintered, bodies fell into red water. Augustus expanded the madness. In 2 BC, he created a basin so vast it needed its own aqueduct. 30 ships entered. None of the prisoners aboard survived. By AD 52, Claudius drained a lake to stage another battle. When the captives greeted him with the chilling line, "Those who are about to die salute you," history gained one of its most haunting echoes. Fire too became theater. Victims cast as Hercules, burned alive in costumes meant to mimic his demise. Others forced to play Mucius Scaevola, holding their hands in flames until flesh turned black and bone gleamed beneath. The audience laughed, entertained by the screams of dying heroes. Even the Coliseum's architecture fed Rome's hunger. Under Titus and later Domitian, engineers carved channels beneath the arena so the sand could flood for naval shows and drain for combat the next day. Cruelty became engineering. Suffering became design. Rome didn't just command men, it tried to command nature itself. By the late 1st century, executions were no longer punishments. They were scripts soaked in malice, twisting legends into tools of humiliation. During the Coliseum's inauguration in AD 80, the poet Martial recorded a performance that blurred the line between art and atrocity. An actor stepped onto the sand as Orpheus, the musician who tamed beasts with song. In myth, animals sat entranced by his lyre. But in the arena, a bear was released mid-performance. It tore him apart in front of a crowd that roared with delight. Beauty transformed into butchery. Another victim was forced to play Daedalus, the inventor who crafted wings of wax. Suspended on a crude wooden frame meant to mimic flight, he glided only for a moment, before plunging into a pit of hungry beasts. Martial wrote, "The man must have wished for real feathers, a poet's jest concealing a man's terror." But Rome could always go lower. Perhaps the most grotesque spectacle of all came from the myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull. In the arena, Her story became a performance of humiliation. A prisoner was forced into a mechanical contraption shaped like the beast. Her suffering turned into a twisted mix of degradation and execution. A warning about hubris transformed into something far darker. Rome owned its myths, just as it owned its people. Heroes, villains, kings, queens. None could escape being remade as props in a pageant of death. For the crowd, these were sideshows, diversions between the real contests. For the condemned, they were agonizing final moments. For Rome, they were propaganda etched into flesh, reminders of power too vast to challenge. Stories weren't written in ink or carved in marble, they were written in blood, branded into skin, carried away as smoke. The boundary between governance and obsession dissolved until an emperor's whim decided who lived, who died, and how slowly it happened. Caligula, infamous for his violent moods, once ran out of animals mid-show. Without hesitation, he ordered spectators dragged from the stands to replace them. They came to watch a spectacle. They became part of it. Nero, consumed by his own reflection, treated the arena as a stage for personal fantasies. Prisoners were costumed as tragic heroes. From plays, then killed in ways that mirrored their scripted fates. Nero called it artistry. Rome whispered another word, madness. And then came Commodus, the emperor who believed he was Hercules reborn. He entered the Coliseum draped in a lion's skin, swinging a club, slaying animals crippled beforehand to guarantee applause. He charged the treasury for his performances, bankrupting the empire while forcing the crowd to cheer. He fought gladiators too, though the fights were rigged from the first heartbeat. Losing was impossible. Applause was mandatory. Domitian weaponized the arena with paranoia, staging midnight hunts by torchlight, keeping Rome on edge, never sure whether amusement might turn into terror. Even the emperors remembered as good embraced the bloodlust. Trajan, celebrated for justice, marked his Dacian victory with 103 days of games, thousands of deaths folded into one long spectacle. For all their glory, these emperors met the same end. Caligula murdered, Commodus strangled. Their legacies remembered not for governance, but for theater written in blood. The arena that lifted them up also exposed their madness. But not every Roman cheered. Philosophers, writers, the early Christians, they left a different record, a quieter one, a record that saw rot behind the marble. Seneca wrote that watching midday executions tore something human from his soul. Violence didn't purify. It poisoned. It seeped into life outside the arena, corroding empathy, twisting the heart. Cicero, decades earlier, condemned cruelty for cruelty's sake, even while acknowledging the crowd's insatiable demand for games. To govern Rome meant feeding the beast. For Christians, the amphitheater was both persecution and proof. Those who refused to renounce their faith were thrown to lions, burned alive, or crucified before tens of thousands. Their deaths were twisted into entertainment. Tertullian called the games seeds of cruelty, a damning indictment of an empire that called injustice sport. Economically, the games devoured fortunes. Emperors impoverished themselves trying to outshine their predecessors with bigger, bloodier spectacles. What once symbolized strength became an act of desperation. Culturally, Rome dulled itself. Citizens who once valued discipline now demanded two things: bread and endless circuses. Juvenal mocked this hunger. To him, it was proof of how far Rome had fallen from its republican ideals. As borders cracked and wealth dried up, the arenas crumbled. The Coliseum, once a roaring heart of empire, stood silent, hollow. A monument to an appetite that helped consume Rome from within. But the moral question lingered. Could a civilization that trained its people to cheer for suffering ever hope to endure? History answered. Today, the Colosseum still rises above Rome, its stone scarred but unbroken. Walk through its tunnels and the echoes linger. Steel against steel, the bellow of beasts, 50,000 voices rising as one. The architecture is easy to admire. The truth behind it is harder. Cruelty rehearsed until it felt ordinary. Rome's arenas weren't just about blood. They were about control, about shaping how citizens thought, obeyed, and believed. Every hunt, every execution, every myth reborn in screams served a single purpose: to make power look eternal. And that is the warning carved into the ruins. A civilization that glorifies violence eventually crumbles beneath its own applause. So tell us, which of these spectacles, the hunts, the living torches, or the emperors drunk on their own performances, reveals Rome's darkest soul? Share your thoughts below. And if this dive into Rome's brutal entertainments held you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next descent into the shadows of history. Until then, remember this: the Coliseum may be quiet now, but its echoes still breathe through the stones.